What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG. We like it in Magic, and today it's Miller time. Now, I had a joke plan where I was going to crack open a beer and be like, oh, but it turns out I'd probably get demonetized for that. And personally, I think beer's gross anyway. I mean, I'm no saint. Don't get it twisted. But beer is just ugh. So you're not going to get that joke. But what you will get is the most competent mill deck I have ever put on this channel. And that's actually kind of saying something. I talk about mill from time to time. To put it mildly, if you Google MTG mill deck, 2 of my mini mill videos come up in the search results. So I have talked about this before because I know a lot of you love mill and you want it to work. It's the perpetual underdog. And I've loved mill since day 1 of my Magic playing career, you know. And I gotta say, this is probably the best mill deck that I've played since, like, Brain Freeze. Not to say that I'm having a brain freeze, but the card, Brain Freeze, that deck. Oof. Shouldn't have done that to myself. I miss Brain Freeze now, but come back to us one day. Maybe. I'm holding out hope. Anyway, this is easily the best mill deck that I've played since at least that time, 10, 15 years ago. How old am I? Jeez. It's the best mill deck I've played in a really long time. Because right now we have a shell of insane Dimir stuff between removal and discard magic, sweepers and stuff. We got all we could ever ask for. Counter spells in Dimir. It's all looking good on that end, but we've also got a shell of really amazing mill cards. So, courtesy of War of the Spark mostly. We got not 2, like everyone's saying, but 3 really good pieces for mill decks in this set. So let's start going over these, starting with Ashiok, the Dream Render. Now Ash Ketchum can immediately mill 4 cards away with each activation, and then clear the bench of Pokemon too. You know, the fact that this exiles opponents' graveyards is just insane gravy. All the things that both, you know, the activated ability and the passive ability shuts off just in standard, kind of a long list. Now, first of all, and maybe most importantly, at present, this shuts down Arclight Phoenix decks, so that's a pretty sweet thing, but there's lots of reasons to want to exile cards out of your opponent's graveyard right now. This will do everything from keep a Gitsu Lava Runner small, which isn't a huge payoff, but at least it's something, you know, to making, like, Find Finality completely dead against us, plus anything else that might reanimate, like the Eldest Reborn. Some people playing that nowadays, and for the last, like, year, so see that card from time to time. There's lots of other stuff that this shuts off. You know, the passive ability is going to shut off a lot of wonky stuff like Mastermind's Acquisition, which is occasionally an important card, but also like Finale of Devastation, Neoform. There are reasons that we search our library in Standard, and they might be edge cases, but there's stuff, you know, if your opponent kills one of your lands with a Field of Ruin, they can't go search up a basic land. Like, things like this will matter and stack up from time to time. She also keeps Terramander from, like, ever adapting and Search for Azcanta from ever flipping. There's so much that Ashiok does, aside from just the mill in this deck. But she's the first thing that's going to illustrate a very important point, and one thing that I think makes this mill deck a lot better than mill decks of the past. See, when you talk to these players who know everything there is to know, they will make the very valid and correct point that mill very often doesn't affect the board in any way, or the game outside of the cards that you're milling. And again, it's actually a very valid point. If you mill your opponent, you know, 5 cards and you don't actually affect the board or their hand in any way, then you haven't actually taken any resources away from them and nothing has actually changed in the game state. Usually milling by itself is pretty bad, but Ashiok is a planeswalker on the board. You've affected the board in that way, but you've also kept your opponent off of all these interesting little case edge interactions, corner interactions that they probably want. Imagine if your opponent is playing Mastermind's Acquisition, they probably want to actually play it, and if your opponent is playing Arclight Phoenix, they probably want to actually play it. So the fact that this card does so much more than mill is really important, but so do all of our other mill pieces. And therein lies the secret to our mill deck. Every single card in the deck that mills cards also affects the board or the game state in some important way or another. And that is something that you absolutely have to have when constructing a mill deck. Yeah, we got 20 different cards in this deck that can mill the opponent, but none of them only do that. You got to keep that in mind. Another real quick piece of tech before I get off of Ashiok is, like I just said, there are 20 mill pieces. So there's going to be a lot of turns where you're putting together mill sequences and playing multiple cards that mill the opponent. In those cases, try and use Ashiok last so that you can mill away all the other stuff you milled that turn. And yes, 4 copies. It's right. Just like the 4 copies of Jace that we're playing. It may seem a little weird to play 4 copies of Jace, but all these Planeswalkers have big targets on their back, and we're not really playing a whole bunch of early game creatures to protect them. We got plenty of removal, but our Planeswalkers won't always be perfectly protected, so I don't mind playing multiple copies, especially multiple copies of Planeswalkers that are integral to the deck's philosophy. We want to see Ashiok and Jace literally every single game of Magic that we play with this deck, so I'm playing playsets. Now, Jace affects the game state in multiple ways. Not only is this a Planeswalker on the board, which does count for something. You know, either it'll gain you life in the form of your opponent having to attack into your Planeswalker, or it'll just get you, you know, a bunch of card advantage over a bunch of different turns. Like, once you plunk this down, this is just free card advantage. Even if it does nothing else for you, you know. The fact that this mills 2 cards a turn isn't much, but it is a free millstone. You know, you don't have to pay 2 to activate your millstone every single turn. So, if nothing else, millstone is historically a playable card in mill decks from the 90s. Well, you know, still, we get a free millstone activation every turn, and we get to draw a card every turn. Drawing 2 cards every turn is insanely important, and if we absolutely have to, we can turn the mill on ourselves in this deck to actually make these 2 Laboratory Maniac clauses worth something. Also, it is kind of hard to argue that Jace doesn't affect the game state when he has the potential of drawing you a full grip of cards. That is a ridiculous refill. And even if you don't get the Lab Maniac clause and just win the game immediately off of his ultimate, you still drew 7 cards. It's like winning the game most of the time. But there is a third important new mill piece from War of the Spark, and everyone seems to keep forgetting that Enter the God Eternals mills them. It's kind of the, it's the worst thing that the card does, but in this deck, it's a really important feature of the card. But gather around, kids, because it's story time with Dev, because let me tell you, this is the card that got me to switch arena decks for like the first time. You know, I do some testing on arena, budget decks, whatever I can craft with like uncommon and common wild cards, but for the most part, I just like to grind games as quickly as possible with mono red, and I've done that for a very long time on arena at this point. But I've run into a roadblock called this stupid card. I kept having to basically scoop to this card even if my opponent was at 2 life when I was playing mono red. If risk factor wasn't in my hand or the graveyard, the game was just more or less over if they resolve into the God Eternals. So, you know, I kind of got in this, like, if you can't beat them, join them mindset, so I have switched over to Dimir Midrange, and this card is what I want to draw on almost every turn past turn 5, and that's no different in this deck, where the power level of this card is summarily juiced even more because we're actually making good work, good use out of that mill clause. If nothing else, the life gain in the body will at least help you establish control of the game. This is board presence and board control in 1 card for 5 mana, which is a relatively steep price, but if you can just make it to this card against the majority of aggro decks in the format, it can be a real death blow to them. I've had so many people scoop to this card on Arena just in the last week since I've been messing around with both this and Dimir Midrange. So many people, when they're at like 20 life, will just scoop to an Enter the God Eternals when I'm at like 5, because the power of this card is absolutely insane, and even though it looks weird to play 4 copies, we want as many of these mill pieces as we can have, and we absolutely can't afford to get steamrolled by aggro, which is our worst matchup. And this kind of solves all of our problems in 1 package. It's also another win condition if you want to be a loser and win by swinging with creatures. What kind of a dork does that? But if you absolutely have to swing and win the game that way because your mill plan just didn't come in together, Enter the God Eternals does give you that chance. You know, 4 of Enter the God Eternals in the deck will lead to a lot of 8/8 armies, and those can win games. I should have ranked this card so much higher on my top 50. This card is just insane, even though I'm not going to call it the best card in Standard or anything. It's probably actually in the top 10 cards from War of the Spark. It's just unbelievable, everything this card does for you, and how easily it allows you to turn the corner against even the most hardcore aggro decks. But there's a couple of more cards that mill the opponent in the deck, and they're not new, and they're not as good either. It's going to be up front with you, but they're still necessary evils. Now, before I go into these last couple of mill cards, let me just say that I was playing like a Drowned Secret Psychic Corrosion package to start this deck off, but it's just not good enough. You know, I'm sorry. I really like the mono blue mill deck. Pulled off a bunch of wins with it on Arena last year, and I know a bunch of people that tried that deck did too. It's a surprisingly good, cheap mono blue mill deck to build in Standard right now. And it does include Corrosion and Drowned Secrets, but this ain't that deck. This deck seeks to establish control of the game, like I've mentioned a couple of times. Ziggy, you gonna get situated here, bub? But anyway, this deck seeks to establish control of the game and then mill the opponent out once all hope is lost. But decks that seek to play Drowned Secrets on 2, Psychic Corrosion on 3, get set up, and then start milling the opponent are just either going to get steamrolled by mono white, mono red right now, or they're just going to get controlled out of the ball game by Esper. So it's just not where you want to be. You want to have answers, like counterspells, for instance, to take out big creatures that'll just eat you in a couple of turns if you don't have the removal for them, and also to counter, you know, counter spells against control decks. So with that in mind, I'm going to play 4 copies of Thought Collapse in the deck. Now, I feel like the deck does need a counter spell, even though not every Dimir control or mid-range deck, not even every Esper control deck, will play counter spells nowadays. But again, I don't want things to slip through the cracks. I don't want to be caught on the back foot against big stuff, or even non-creature big stuff like Planeswalkers. And this is a great just 3-mana answer that also aids our mill plan, so I will include a counterspell, especially considering we're trying to beef up the 3-drop slot a little bit. This card will save your bacon a lot, and you guys know how much I like bacon. But the final mill piece in this puzzle is the 4 copies of Wall of Lost Thoughts, and ironically, I put a lot of thought into playing this card, or not, because this is taking the slot over Discovery Dispersal, which is in pretty much most, and Discovery Dispersal does not keep us from getting steamrolled by early creatures, whereas Law wanted one more decent mill piece in the deck, and Wall of Lost Thoughts can hold down the fort really well in the early game until you do establish control, and again, 4 cards is 4 cards. Now, pretty much the entirety of the rest of the shell here is just like Dimir good stuff, removal, hand disruption, sweepers, all that kind of stuff. So I won't have to spend too much time on this half of the deck, but it's really important that you play these cards, starting with Tyrant Scorn. This does some pretty cool stuff in this deck. Not only can it keep our opponent off of Benalish Marshal, Thief of Sanity, all kinds of creatures from 3 CMC under. I mean, that's kind of the best function of the card, is just pure 2-mana instant speed removal. But if you do have to pop something back to a hand, there's a lot of different ways you can use that. First of all, we're playing a counterspell in this deck. So you can pop a creature back to your opponent's hand, you know, if it's a little big, too big for Tyrant Scorn to just kill, and then just counter it when they play it again. That's a time-honored tradition since Unsummon plus Counterspell in like 1993, and we can do that in this deck. But if you absolutely need more mill, and your opponent doesn't have any creatures you really want to kill at the time, then you can just pop your Wall of Lost Thoughts back to your hand with the Tyrant Scorn, play it again, get another activation, get another trigger from that end of the battlefield. So that's another cool thing to do. That makes Tyrant Scorn not entirely dead in the control matchup, where you're not going to be able to point it at your opponent's creatures. Still point it at Wall of Lost Thoughts. That's going to be important plays. But we're also running 2 copies of Cast Down in the deck. Don't have to spend much time on this one. I would imagine just run Cast Down. It's good. It's a good Magic card. Play Cast Down if you're looking for really good removal. It's about as good as it gets in Standard at this point. But we're also playing 2 copies of Cry of the Carnarium, which began life as 3 copies of Cry of the Carnarium. But we are trending towards a lot of, especially at the top tiers here, at the top of the ladder on Arena, we're really running up against a lot of Esper. At least I am. Card's just not as effective in those matchups, and I really don't want to draw dead against Esper. We're actually very good in that matchup. But at the same 2 copies of Cry is right. There's another one in the sideboard, plus another sweeper for that aggro matchup. But when you do draw this against aggro, it's just going to be like a 3-for-1 a lot of the time. Against mono white, this is a 3-for-1 on turn 3, a great percentage of the time, even if you're on the play. So yeah, a couple of copies of Cry of the Carnarium is a necessary evil. I'm also going way off the deep end and just playing all 4 copies of Vraska's Contempt. I'm not messing around. We got to play this. Like, every deck plays Planeswalkers now, so we just have like twice as many targets as usual for Vraska's Contempt. There's just targets everywhere for this stupid thing. Plus, we need the life gain in the aggro matchup. Like, yeah, we got Enter the God Eternals, but Vraska's Contempt, your, Chain Whirler, and Enter the God Eternals, your other creature, is always a crazy, play, and that sequence is going to put us right back in the game, even if we're at like 2. So, Vraska's Contempt is just insane. It's really important to make sure we don't just get run over by aggro, but also that we have answers to the wide variety of walkers in the format right now. I'm also playing 4 copies of Thought Erasure, because this is, maybe the best card you can play in Dimir right now. Similar in name to Thought Collapse, but a lot better, and like literally the opposite of that card. Like, this is proactive rather than reactive, so that's interesting, even though the naming conventions are similar. But anyway, I'm getting up my own butt with flavor at this point. Getting up my own butt with flavor. Hate to do this twice in one video, but like, ugh. Anyway, Thought Erasure is just as gross as that imagery against a lot of decks right now, whether you're playing against aggro, control, mid-range, combo like Nexus, whatever. Just Thought Erasure is going to do work in literally every matchup in Standard. And there's a reason that I called it maybe the best Dimir card that you can play. Just if you're playing blue and black in your deck, play Thought Erasure. It's not rocket science. But finally, we're running one copy of Negate to finish off the main deck, and you can do a lot with this slot, but I think that a reactive piece that makes sure the board doesn't get too out of control over there on your side, I see what you're doing, opponent, is probably the right thing to play. And Negate is just more main deckable than it was last season, and it was main deckable last season, to my mind at least. You know, this is going to counter all kinds of Planeswalkers while also protecting our own Planeswalkers, which is an important feature of the card. Play the one Negate. Now here's the mana base, 24 lands in this thing, a total of 18 blue sources to help us get to that 3 blue Jace on turn 4, but we've also got 16 black sources, because if you didn't notice, we're also trying to get to Cry the Carnarium on 3. It can be a tough thing to do, and it doesn't leave us any room for things like Blast Zone or Field of Ruin, for instance. Those are lands I'd really like to play, but we gotta prioritize our colored sources. We just don't have room for those things. And of course, let's take a look at the board. Most of this is going to be against Control, Esper for the most part. Read Esper when you hear Control, but there is Jeskai Control. You know, for the most part, though, we're just trying to deal with these reactive decks that can kind of cut off our game plan at the knees before we can really do anything about it. That includes aggro. That's why you see things like the extra Cry the Carnarium to make 3 copies, the Ritual of Soot. Don't worry, I'll talk about the Deep Freeze. We'll get there right now. Gods included, which can be really important, but that is why the Deep Freeze is in there. Like, yeah, we can counter Gods with Thought Collapse or Disdainful Stroke, but I really, really like Deep Freeze for catching Gods that have slipped through the cracks for whatever reason. You know, an Oketra or a Kefnet. This is going to just turn them into a 0/4 that doesn't have any abilities, and it's a lot more effective than removing it from the board in the first place. I know this is like really stupid tech right here, but hey, the mono blue deck already plays Deep Freeze in its sideboard for these same situations. Played it to get rid of Rekindling Phoenix last season. It's still good against that card. There's lots of reasons why you might want to play Deep Freeze, but there's not enough reasons to play more than the one copy, in my mind. We've also got a copy of the Elder Spell. You might notice that. I actually want to bump this up to 2 or 3 copies. Emma Handy has been talking on Twitter about how good this card is. So has Wedge over at the Mana Source. You know, a lot of talk in just the last few days about how, oh my god, the Elder Spell is ridiculous. So I wouldn't mind trying out multiple copies of the spell, but the one copy has been good enough when drawn against these heavy Planeswalker matchups. You know, a lot of Esper decks and even Orzhov decks will play a bunch of different Planeswalkers right now, and those aren't the only decks that are playing Walkers. But especially in Esper, you know, you see Narset, the occasional Davriel, and even Dovin in the 3-drop slot, not to mention, obviously, Teferi Time Raveler, plus 5 mana Teferi. There's just tons and tons of Walkers people are playing right now. So I would really suggest this. Either this or maybe even Price of Betrayal, but I just think the Elder Spell is obviously the much better card, especially in a deck full of Planeswalkers. We got 8 in this deck, and being able to Elder Spell a couple of their guys off the battlefield and ultimate your Jace is a game-winning play about 98% of the time. Plus, beating Nick Bolas is important as well. There's 1,000 reasons to play the Elder Spell. You should try it out if you haven't tried it out yet. But there's also Unmoored Ego, which is sort of mill piece. You could classify it that way. You know, taking a bunch of cards out of our opponent's deck is technically mill, but this is also just death and murder against, you know, combo decks. And even control decks, just taking either Teferi out of their deck is going to affect them in a huge way. So I like so much about Unmoored Ego in most blue-black sideboards, but it's kind of even better when you're not only depriving them of resources, their most important resources, but you're also kind of milling them too in this deck, so why not play it? There's also a copy of Connive Concoct. This is getting like really deep rabbit hole tech here, but I think this is just playable enough for one copy. But it's another card I don't want to play more than one copy of, because there's probably better ways we can flex those slots, like Liliana Dreadhorde General, for instance. Last card in our board. Now, this might actually enrage you because it's easily the most expensive card in the deck. Even though Watery Grave is like 17 bucks right now. What's that about? But it should not cost that much. But Liliana is like 26 bucks, and if you don't want to play it, there's multiple ways to replace it. Plague Crafter is a good one. Liliana's Triumph is a fine one too. There's multiple ways to deal with a Carnage Tyrant, which is mostly why Liliana is here, is to deal with Carnage Tyrants, especially in game 2 and 3. But even against these Nissa or just like green-based rampy decks right now, these mid-range green decks, you'll come up against Carnage Tyrant in main decks a good percentage of the time now. But Liliana does so much more than just play well against Carnage Tyrant. But anyway, here are your power rankings right here. A final score of Nintendo 64. This is actually a surprisingly deep deck. You know, we've got a really good removal suite. No one could argue that Dimir doesn't have a great removal package right now. Plus, Thought Erasure is not just one of the best cards in Dimir, but like maybe one of the best cards in Standard, hands down, and we get access to that in this deck. Plus, Enter the God Eternals, which is better than usual, even. You know, Jace, which is actually a great Planeswalker just because he draws you an extra card every turn. Like, there's a lot of like real power in this deck, even though it just looks like a crappy mill deck. And yeah, if you wanted to, you could take this deck as your starting point and then get your Kefnets and stuff and build blue-black mid-range or blue-black control off of this jumping off point, because it still has all the tools that a Dimir deck needs to take over the game. Dimir specializes in that right now. You know, we got Esper and Grixis at the top tiers of Standard at the moment, and that's because blue-black is such a ridiculously good base if you're trying to take control of a game. We do it very well in this deck. Plus, we have card advantage tools like Jace to make sure that we out-card advantage the opponent, while also having plenty of tools to mill the opponent out so we can actually win a game. Plus, as previously stated, but again, I'll reiterate because it's like the most important thing about the deck, our mill cards don't just mill. Like, all of our mill onto it is going to function very well in a lot of games. So I'm telling you, know that for a fact. Put plenty of mill decks on the channel, and even though mill is always fun, a really decent mill deck. So please give this thing a shot if you can. If you wanted to do that in paper, then just check the first link in the description. Go over to TCG Play It. They sponsor your boys' content, so they're good to me. They're good to me in that way, but they're also the cheapest place you're going to get this deck. It's south of $200 right now, but if you finagled the land base a little bit, cut the Lilianas in the sideboard, you could get it down to well below $100 and play this mill deck that still has access to all of the hand disruption like Thought Erasure, all of the removal like Tyrant Scorn, Cast Down, Vraska's Contempt, all of that. You can still play Vraska's Contempt on a relatively low budget nowadays. So I'm telling you, even if you mess around with this deck, it doesn't get that much, like, you know, weaker. So give this thing a shot, whether you pay like $175 for it, whatever, or you go all the way and buy this thing for the $200 price tag because of the Lilianas and the Watery Grave. It's still going to function pretty well and do what it's supposed to be doing. So try this thing out if you can, report back, let me know how you feel about it and what you'd change differently down there in the comments section. Aside from that, put me in the recommended feed of more people by just hitting the like button. You know, that spreads the love around YouTube. Make sure more people can see stupid decks like this. So just hit the like button if you do nothing else. But if you want more homework, just hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for the notifications so you know when I actually do put videos out. It's an important thing if you want to watch my videos. You should know when they come out. Or you can just throw $1 into the Patreon, and that way I'll let you vote on what decks you want to see next. Made it this far into the video. Anyway, pretty sure that's it for this one. Just let me know how you felt about everything down there in the sideboard. Click the links in the description to go to the places, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.